Well, all right. I think it's about a minute or two after, so I think I'll get going. It has been a nice day, and it's October, and it is continuing to be. I every time I come back to Exodus, I am always learn something new and enjoy. I think when I teach it now, having been to Israel, it comes off a little differently, and that'll come out here in a couple of times. But we ended last time, we were in chapter 16, where the people were hungry. So we're in chapter 16, and they were grumbling and saying, oh man, it was so good when we were slaves. You know, we had food, and we ate all these good food. And why'd you bring us out here to starve us to death? And then God, through Moses, said, well, I'm going to send you bread and meat. And I think we ended more or less in 16, about 6, where Moses and Aaron said to the Israelites, in the evening you'll know that it was Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord, because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said. You know, it was the Lord who gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us. You're grumbling against the Lord. And that word grumble is in there multiple times. And then jump down to verse 11. God says to Moses, I've heard the grumbling. Tell them at twilight they'll eat meat. In the morning you'll be filled with bread, and you'll know that I am Yahweh, your God. And sure enough, that evening, verse 13, the quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. Now, by the way, again, sometimes when folks are saying these miracles can be explained in a more naturalistic way, apparently there is quail do cross over this desert area frequently at different times of year, and sometimes they get so exhausted from the flight they land and rest and are easy to catch. But this seems to be not just a seasonal thing. This seems to be a continual thing for 40 years. So I don't think we can explain it just as migration patterns. So there are quail that are to be found to eat, and then verse 14, when the dew was gone, the flakes, thin flakes like frost on the ground, appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they didn't know what it was. And, you know, I think I've mentioned this before. The word manna literally means, what is it? They called it, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. They'd never seen it before. And, you know, it was like us going, whatchamacallit, or thingamajig. They didn't know what else to call it. So here's the instructions about the manna. It's picking up there in verse 15. It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what Yahweh's commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person. An omer is about 2 quarts, if you're trying to calculate how much that is, for each person you have in your tent. And the Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. When they measured it by the omer, he who gathered much didn't have too much. He who gathered little didn't have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. And here's the proviso with the manna. 19, no one is to keep any of it until morning. This kind of gets back to the idea of your daily bread. This is enough bread for that day, for that morning. Here's the bread. They'll wake up. It'll be on the ground. It's for today. Don't try to hoard it. Don't try to save it. Don't try to keep it overnight. This is your bread for the day. No one is to keep it until morning. However, people never pay attention. People don't follow the rules. Verse 20, however, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. You know, and some things, of course, never change. Sometimes people, you say, do something, and they'll go, well, I'm going to do this anyway. And that's what they did. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as he needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted away. But on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, save whatever's left, and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is the Sabbath of the Lord. You won't find any on the ground today. 6 days you're to gather it. On the 7th day, on the Sabbath, you won't find any." So you get this idea of this distribution of the manna. For 5 days, it would be one meal's worth. On the 6th day, there would be twice as much manna on the ground, and they were to gather up twice as much just for that one day. And on just that one day, it wouldn't have maggots in it overnight. It would keep just that day. And then on the 7th day, there's none on the ground in the morning. So this is the rhythm of the Sabbath. This is why they're not going to be working. They won't be gathering the manna is work. So they're not going to work on the Sabbath, but God's going to provide a double portion just that one time a week, and that's the only time it won't spoil. And then we read about what happened. So they did it. And nevertheless, 27, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. In other words, once again, they did not pay attention to the instructions given them by Moses. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions?" In other words, how are you going to just keep ignoring what I tell you? "Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone's to stay where he is on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. Now, one of the things about this, and I guess you got a whistle in your hearing aid there for a second there. One of the things you'll discover here is you're like, now wait a minute. We haven't had the 10 Commandments yet. How do they know about the Sabbath? How are they supposed to know about the 7th day and the Sabbath yet? Because, we haven't actually seen that commandment about keeping the Sabbath so far. Well, here's something as we're going to go through this book, as we continue to go through this book, that we're going to see, and I'll have to point out this multiple times. The Hebrew writers who recorded this after, remember, I said last week, this story is not like, even though in the Middle Ages people said, well, Moses was there writing it down every day like a journal, including the last part where it records his own death. That these are called the books of Moses because he's the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And, this is from the pen of Moses, written just as it was happening. Well, it never says that. It never credits Moses with being the author of these books. But that was the way that people thought for centuries until probably 200 or 300 years ago when what we would call modern scholarship arises. And modern scholarship would say, no, these stories were told and passed along orally for a long time before they were ever written into this final form. And the people who finally recorded these oral stories were not terribly concerned with chronology. They were not terribly concerned with keeping things in a chronological order. Because here it mentions keeping the Sabbath. Well, you might say, well, we don't actually have the 10 Commandments and about the Sabbath for another couple of chapters. They were totally unconcerned about that kind of thing. And here's what I compared it to. I was thinking of a modern comparison, and this is just something that happens to me. When I've, over the 38, 39 years that I've been a pastor, I've done several hundred funerals, and I've gotten to where I have a certain way that I prepare them. And some of you know this, I meet with the family to kind of get the biographical information about the person whose service I'm going to do, because I'd like to talk about it. And so I always tell them right up front, you have to tell me things chronologically. I'm going to start with where was he or she born, and where they go to grade school, and things like that. And I'll ask that, they do that. And then we'll start talking, and they went, he went to this high school, he played basketball. But later in life, he switched over to golf when he was 60, and he started playing golf then. And they've jumped 40 years forward and start talking about what happened when he was 60. And sometimes I'll say, okay, let's stay chronological. And a story will pop into their head, and it'll remind them of something, and we're going back and forth in time, and I'll try hopefully gently to keep it somewhat chronological. But people, when they're telling stories about people that they know, they don't always come out chronologically. When you're telling stories about your kids, you are not always chronological. You might be in the middle of telling a story of what happened when they were 10, and then you'll jump back to when they were 5, and then you'll jump up to when they were 15. And you're not concerned with that, because you're just, one story leads to another, and you're not staying chronological. Well, in a much bigger sense, in the book of Hebrews, sometimes the laws that are given are already being enforced before you get there, like the Sabbath law. And that's just because, in the same way, even when I was talking about Simon Peter on Sunday, he isn't given the name Peter until much later in the story. But right off the bat, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John call him Peter way before Jesus gives him that nickname. They already start calling him Peter in the Bible before chronologically he's given that nickname. Because by the time they're writing it, everybody knows him as Peter. So, if we were being strict about writing a biography of somebody and they were given a nickname later in life, we might not use that nickname at the beginning of the story. And then later on, when they get the nickname, then we would start referring to it. But the Hebrew people don't care about any of that. They don't care about the chronology like we would. It's going to be sometimes out of order like that. Not in the narrative, but in the application of certain laws and customs and things. Often they're going to be sprinkled in there, and it's going to be like, wait a minute, they didn't know that yet. Well, the Hebrew authors don't really, that's not their concern, I guess would be the best way to put that. So here we have them talking about the Sabbath, even though the commandment about the Sabbath hasn't really been introduced yet. So, having said all that, this story of the manna is a way of showing God was serious about this manna stuff. It's not going to show up on the Sabbath. And of course, remember, when we start talking about the Sabbath for the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Sabbath is sundown Friday through sundown Saturday. That's the Sabbath. The Shabbat. That's what the word in Hebrew, the word Saturday means Sabbath. So, again, if we're being super picky, when we call Sunday the Sabbath, we're being somewhat inaccurate, since the word Sabbath literally does mean Saturday in Hebrew. But it has become the Christian Sabbath, the Christian day of rest, the Christian holy day. So I'm myself now, I'm all out of order chronologically, because I'm talking about Jesus now, and I'm talking about Christianity when we're back in Exodus. So, what about this manna? Verse 31. 16:31. The people of Israel called the bread manna. Remember, which means, what is it? It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, this is what Yahweh's commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the desert when I brought you out of Egypt. Moses said to Aaron, take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Place it before the Lord to be kept for generations to come. This eventually is a jar that is like, look, this is to remind us of what happened in the desert. And this is assuming does not get full of maggots. This ends up eventually inside the Ark of the Covenant. But the Ark of the Covenant hasn't been made yet, hasn't been built yet. There are certain artifacts placed inside the Ark of the Covenant as a reminder of God's miraculous things. We don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. unless we believe Indiana Jones. Otherwise, we don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. We'll read about it in multiple places in the Old Testament, and then it just disappears, basically, with the Babylonian invasion. It's probably stripped of gold and taken to Babylon, probably. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna in front of the testimony that it might be kept. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to the land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And then it mentions to us an omer is a tenth of an ephah. That helps us, right? So, but as I say, an omer is about 2 quarts. So if you can just kind of do the math on that. So they got quail and they got bread, but you need water. Verse 7, chapter 17, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, and it has nothing to do with sin as in you sinned, you did something wrong. It's a place name that's not, it's just spelled the same, but it's not connected to that. Traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. They quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" You know, this is going to be a familiar chorus all through this book. The grumbling, the whining, the complaining. Although water is pretty important. I mean, if you're in the middle of the desert, you do probably need water. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And this is an ongoing feature of the relationship between Moses and God. Moses continually says, basically, "Why did you give me this job?" Because these people are driving me nuts. He calls them stiff-necked. They're stubborn. They're complaining all the time. They won't follow the rules. They're not listening. I mean, Moses is continually basically saying, "Why in the world did you put me in the position of trying to lead these people? Because these people are like herding cats. It's just not working. They're rebelling. They're complaining. They're not an easy group to lead." So verse 5, the Lord answered Moses, "Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, that same staff, and go, and I'll stand there before you by the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders. He called the place Massah and Meribah. Massah means testing, and Meribah means quarreling. So he calls the place Massah and Meribah. He calls it testing and quarreling is what he called that place. Because the Israelites quarreled and they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord not among us? Or is the Lord among us or not?" You know, some people have said, these are people who have seen miraculous things. I mean, they've seen the plagues that hit Egypt that did not hit them. They've seen the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptian chariots. They've seen now this food and bread and quail feeding them. They've seen this pillar of cloud that is leading them. And yet they continue to say, well, what's this God doing to us? Is he really going to get us out of here safely? Or is he really going to lead us? Did he bring us out here to kill us? Their faith is not very steady. And I think, at least I think most of us think, well, if God did that many miracles, we would never doubt anything. We would never question anything if God was doing those. If we had witnessed miracles like that, we would fall in line and never question anything. Well, would we? I don't know. Again, jumping to the New Testament, he tells remember the parable of the rich fool, the man who is wealthy, and there's the poor man at his gate, and and they both die. And Lazarus, he gives the poor man at the gate, Jesus gives the name Lazarus, which is the name, of course, of his friend that he raises from the dead. In the parable, in the parable, it says Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham, which is kind of a Hebrew way of talking about paradise. And the rich man, who never cared a whit for anybody except himself, is in torment. And there's no water. But they can see each other, which is not meant to be necessarily an accurate depiction of eternity. It's just a parable. But the rich man cries out to Abraham and says, hey, tell Lazarus to get me some water, And Abraham says, no, it doesn't work that way. There's this gulf we can't cross. And then the rich man says, well, I got 7 brothers back home who are just like me. They don't fear man or God. They're just as rotten as I am. Send Lazarus back to earth to warn them not to do what I did, or they're going to end up here with me. And Jesus says, Abraham says, they wouldn't believe a man even if he rose from the dead. Which, of course, is Jesus saying that's what he's going to do. He's going to rise from the dead, and people still won't believe. People still won't fall in line. People still won't have faith, even if somebody rises from the dead. So, back to the book of Exodus. The people go, is the Lord among us or not? Part of this is remembering this idea this understanding that Yahweh, the Lord, is the only God. And that is an idea that is not immediately grasped by these people, notice, because they've just left Egypt that is full of gods. And this idea that those gods are not real has not fully sunk into them. It doesn't sink in for generations, really, the idea that Yahweh is not only their God, but he is the God, the only God. There is, among ancient people, this sort of idea that each nation or country or tribe or people have their own God and their own territory. And if you leave that territory and go into a neighboring area, well, now you're under the jurisdiction of a different God. It's sort of this idea of gods are like governors. and that's the way most of the people in the ancient world think. Well, this is your God, and this is his God, and this is her God, and this is my God. And, your God is the God of your land and your country, and this God is the God of his country. And this idea of a multitude of gods over a multitude of areas. If you remember, let me jump forward a little bit to the Jonah story. Jonah's on the boat, running away from his God, from Yahweh. The boat is under terrible duress, and the captain says to all the people on the boat, everybody better pray to their own God and get us out of this mess. And Jonah says, well, my God is Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, but he's apparently the only one on the boat that's his God. And they're all praying, well, whatever God's up there, stop the storm. So this is the mindset of ancient people. There's all these different gods out there. And it's the Hebrew people who bring to the world, even people who are not religious, even people who are atheists, all agree that it is through Israel and through the Jewish people that the idea of monotheism, one God, comes into the world. The idea that there's just one God, that comes from Judaism. But it doesn't sink in to even the Jewish people immediately. They still, remember, are tempted to follow all these other foreign gods. When they get to Canaan, I'm jumping ahead, just like I said, people do. When they get to the Canaan, and they are tempted to follow Baal, these other gods, things like that. So they're doubting God's protection out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. So, going on to verse 8. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out and fight the Amalekites. tomorrow I'll stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So the Amalekites, we know, are a nomadic people who tended to, and this we believe historically, they tended to be in the area between Egypt and Canaan, and marauding bands of raiders. Some of this, as we read some of these confrontations they have, when we go back to the number of people who came out of Egypt in the Exodus, and it's like, 500,000, that might not be an accurate number. It might not be quite that many. Because if you really got 500,000 people out there in the desert, some of these other stories don't really line up very well. But however many there were, they have to go fight these raiders, these nomadic raiders. And he says, I'm going to go stand on the hill with the staff of God in my hands. And this is a really interesting little passage here. Verse 10. So Joshua, remember Joshua is sort of the general. He's also Moses' second in command. He's also the one who will eventually take command when Moses dies. Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, holding that staff, the staff that he could turn into a snake and that he held, and held the water and the water spot, that staff that God gave him that had this power, this miraculous power to it. As long as Moses held up his hands with the staff, the Israelites were winning. Whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And then Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so his hands remained steady until sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. So, as long as Moses was standing there with that staff in his hand, Israelite would win. But after an hour or two, your arm gets tired. You can only hold your arms up high for so long. And his arms would get tired, and he'd start lowering his arms, and then the tide of the battle would turn. And then, I got to get my arms up again, and then Israel would start winning. And until they finally decided, they got one guy on his left, one guy on his right, holding his arms up until they win the battle. And I've never preached this, but I've heard other pastors preach that, we need to hold each other's arms up, symbolically, metaphorically here. And I get the point. We need to support each other and lift each other up. But the story here is about this idea that Moses' holding up this staff gave power to Joshua and his men as they're fighting this battle. And because it is a memorable victory, verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. That little verse is interesting for one little notable thing. It's the first time in the Bible that writing is mentioned. That writing on a scroll is mentioned. There's never, before that, anything is written on a scroll before that. So Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "For hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." And I mention that because my Bible has a little note which says we believe civilization mastered the skill of writing somewhere around 3400 BC, when a society near present-day Iraq introduced it. It says this is the Bible's first mention of the practice of writing. Moses' training in Egypt would have included writing on paper made from the pulpy reeds of the papyrus plant, which was the same thing they made the little boat out of that they put him in the Nile. But ancient paper would be papyrus. And so this is the first time. Now, 3400 BC is quite a bit before the events of Exodus. The events of Exodus, I said, we're talking maybe 1300 BC, probably. So, now remember, way back in Midian, Moses had married a local Midianite girl and become part of that group, and he had a father-in-law named Jethro. Well, now Jethro re-enters the picture, verse 18. Jethro, the priest of Midian, chapter 18, and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. So after Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. So, in other words, Moses is going through all this conflict with Pharaoh. He has sent his wife and his 2 sons back to Midian to live with her dad there. One son was named Gershom, which is kind of a pun because the word Gershom in Hebrew sounds a lot like the word for alien. For Moses said, I have become an alien in a foreign land. The other son was named Eleazar, which means God is my help. For he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Hebrew names always mean something. They're not just words or sounds. They always have a meaning. And not always a happy meaning. I mean, not always. Some names are kind of sad. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Apologize for folks. Yeah. 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 I mean, maybe it just maybe more means like that people is not going to have any history. I mean, they're not going to. There's going to be no descendants of that group. That group is going to end up being sort of wiped out and forgotten. Some of these nations. You might say, well, where are the Philistines today? Well, I mean, some of these nations that are mentioned here, we don't know of any nation that has that name now. Only Israel is the one that carries on. I mean, Egypt does, obviously, but I mean, of these other ites, we don't know about Hittites and Jebusites and all these other ites, Philistines. But yeah, it blotted out. Except you're right, that's just right here in black and white. Right. Although, I mean, it would be like, when you say it's not like necessarily there was never any descendants, but they're lost like a bottle of ink poured into a bathtub. I mean, they're no longer a people. They no longer have a heritage. They no longer have a culture. Because, for one thing, we know that, again, jumping forward all the way to when the Assyrian Empire conquers the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they bring in all kinds of foreign people from all different places, and over generations, they'll intermarry with each other. And whatever identity, cultural and ethnic identity they had before, it all just gets diluted and mixed up until they just become known as Samaritans. But the ancestors of the Samaritans, some of them were Jewish, some of them were probably Philistines or whatever ites, but they no longer have that ethnic identity. You might even say same thing about some of us in America. We're the great melting pot, and some of us know a lot about our heritage. And I know I'm more Irish than anything, but I don't think of myself as Irish anymore. I think of myself as American. And I think the Samaritans thought of themselves as Samaritans, not the fact that they were a Heinz 57 mix of all different kinds of people who lived in that part of the world. So Jethro brings Moses' wife and sons back to him now in the desert. And it says, verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the desert, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and your sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law about everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they'd met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. And basically, everything that we had just read, Moses tells Jethro. And Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to Yahweh, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and of Pharaoh, who's rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the other gods." Notice there, he doesn't say, "I know that Yahweh is the only God." He says, "I know that he is greater than the other gods," because he is a Midianite. He's not an Israelite. He has now just come in. He has started to learn about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it's still new information to him. He was a priest of Midian, but not a priest of Yahweh, not a priest of the Lord. He was a priest of the Midianite gods, where Moses goes. He's greater than all the other gods. He did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, as in Yahweh, as in the Lord. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. So he at this point turns his worship and allegiance to the God that Moses has introduced him to. He becomes a follower and a worshiper now of Yahweh. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge? All these people stand around you from morning till evening." Moses answered him, "Well, because the people come to me to seek God's will, and whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws." And Moses' father-in-law said, "What you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work's too heavy for you. You can't handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I'll give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and the laws, show them the way to live and the duties they're to perform, but select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain. Appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times. Have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide for themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they'll share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you'll be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. So yeah, Moses was spending from morning till evening, all day long, settling people's arguments, settling people's disputes. She took my chicken. That's my goat. And his goat ate my dress. Whatever. And Moses is all day long settling arguments between all these people. And Jethro says, "You're going to wear yourself out. You're not going to be able to handle it." And he says, you gotta delegate. You gotta delegate. And and Moses sees the wisdom of that and sets up a system that there's the city judge and the county judge and the state court and the state Supreme Court and the district court and the Supreme Court and there's all these levels and layers of being able to settle things. And the same goes for, a company, a church, or whatever else. There reaches a point where one person can't do everything, and it has to be delegated out. This is, I think almost every pastor seminar I've ever been to reads this passage, about the fact that a pastor can't do everything. And, and that applies to pretty much any larger organization. You got to delegate stuff. And that lesson is pretty clearly right here in the Bible, that you have to delegate stuff. And Moses sees the wisdom in his father-in-law's words. So now we're almost ready for what people think of as the main event of this. Well, if the main event is really the Passover, but we're going to get to the Ten Commandments here. And we got to get ready to receive the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Excuse me. On the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. And you might say, where is Mount Sinai? We don't know. There's lots of theories. There's lots of debate. There's lots of different people who think they can identify this mountain or that mountain or this mountain or that mountain as Mount Sinai, but there's not agreement as to what mountain is the mountain. Moses went up to see God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you're to say to the house of Jacob, what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen that what I did to Egypt. I carried you on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possessions. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you're to speak to the Israelites. A couple of really important things there. One is this word covenant, because the word covenant is used multiple times throughout the scriptures. And there are different covenants. The covenant is after the flood. The covenant between God and humanity, where God says, never again will the earth be destroyed by flood. And the sign of the covenant is his bow in the clouds. The rainbow is the sign of the covenant. This is usually called the Mosaic covenant. But before the Mosaic covenant, there is the Abrahamic covenant. When God, says, after we have those prehistory stories of the Garden of Eden and the flood and the Tower of Babel, and we get to chapter 12 of Genesis, and we focus down on this one guy, Abraham, and his wife Sarah, and their story, and their children, and their grandchildren, and etc. And that's the rest of the Bible focused on the family of Abraham. And then we get to Exodus, and it's the huge family of Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant is weird because it's circumcision. This is the covenant that God makes with Abraham. Every son is to be circumcised, and that is a sign that they are a part of this covenant, this family. So the covenant of Noah is the rainbow. The covenant of Abraham is circumcision. And now we get to the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. And this is going to be this, the Ten Commandments and all that goes with it. And it's him saying it's God saying to the descendants of Abraham now, the nation of Israel, the Hebrew people, if you will obey me and follow me, he says, verse 5, if you'll obey me fully and keep my covenant. The word in Hebrew there is berit, B-E-R-I-T, berit. Then out of all nations you'll be my treasured possession. A covenant is not just a handshake. It's not just a contract. It is an agreement between God and people. And God always keeps his covenant. Now, people break it all the time, but God always keeps the covenant. So notice he says, the descendants of Abraham will be my treasured possession. But the whole earth is mine. But you'll be what? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is the same promise made to Abraham. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The idea is that the message of Yahweh, the message of God, the people of Israel are to be those who disseminate the message of God to the rest of the world, a kingdom of priests. They are chosen not for privilege, but chosen for a special responsibility to bring the message of God to the nations. They are intended to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so when we talk about the chosen people, people hear that, and often when they talk about the people of Israel are a chosen people, not chosen for privilege, not chosen to be rulers over everybody else, chosen to be, as it says here, a kingdom of priests. They are supposed to bring the good news of God to the rest of the earth. So that is the covenant made here with Moses and the people. So Moses goes back and summons the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people respond, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So really at that point, the covenant is made at that point. Before we have the Ten Commandments, God says, "Will you follow all my commandments? And you'll be my special people, and you'll be a kingdom of priests." And they'll go, "Yes, Lord, we'll do it." And this is the covenant that's laid out for them. So verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Moses told the Lord what the people had said. The Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready for the third day. On that day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain. Tell them, be careful. You don't go up on the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. He will surely be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on him. Man or animal, he shall not be permitted to live." This is holy ground. Nobody's supposed to touch it, go up there, walk up there. This mountain is off limits, except for certain people. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, then they can go up the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them. They washed their clothes. He said to the people, "Prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations." I think it's not a diss on sexual relations. I think it's just a matter of focus. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud over the mountain, a loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. They stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke as the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled. The sound of the trumpet grew louder. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. And the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses up to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people, so they don't force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." So Moses said to the Lord, "The people can't come up on Mount Sinai. You yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain. Set it apart as holy." The ruler said, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you, but the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he'll break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. So there's this image that is in movies and everything else. This is the time when Moses is to meet God on Mount Sinai, to receive the law, to receive the commandments. And we get now to the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. Which probably the most well-known chapter in Exodus. God spoke these words: "I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Excuse me. "You shall have no other gods before me." That's one. That's pretty. It doesn't take a lot of explanation. Just he's the only God. Now, we could talk all about how people make other things into gods, but it's pretty straightforward. He is the God, the only God. He is Yahweh. 2, "You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth below or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, remember, the ancient people who believed in a pantheon of gods would go into temples, and there in the temple there would be statuary of some kind, idols. They would often have little idols in their own home, household gods and idols. You know, did ancient people believe those pieces of rock or stone or wood or gold or silver or whatever, did they believe they literally were gods? No, I don't think that's the way they really understood it. They believed that if it was a statue of Baal, that Baal for the Canaanites was a fertility god, and the idol was in some ways had the essence of Baal, had the spirit of Baal, that you could communicate with Baal by praying to the physical idol. And they would pray to the physical idol of Baal for rain, for their crops to grow, for their animals to produce big herds of good animals, etc. They would pray to these gods. And, you know, when we get to Greece and Rome and all this, and you've got a temple of Athena. There's a statue of Athena, and she's the goddess of wisdom. You go to Athena, and there's a statue of Athena, and you're praying for wisdom. You go to the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and there were prostitutes working there. And in sleeping with the sacred prostitute, you were claiming fertility. I mean, and on, and the different gods in, you know, these pantheon of gods. So the other ancient people had idols. And Yahweh says, no statues of Yahweh. No idols of Yahweh. No little, in the temple of, in the tabernacle and in the temple of Israel, there is not a statue of God. There is not an idol of God. And that is forbidden. You know, now people have different opinions about Christian art, you know, and religious art. I've been to the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, and there on the ceiling, you know, is that famous painting of God with his finger reaching down to Adam that you've seen a million times. I mean, you know, is that idolatry? Most people would say, no, that's not idolatry. We're not praying to that painting. We're not, you know, we're not worshiping that painting. Different people disagree. The Puritans, when the Puritans revolted in England, they cleansed the churches of any art whatsoever. 4 blank walls in a Puritan church. No stained glass windows, no nothing. 4 blank walls. They wanted to make sure they were avoiding any form of idolatry. Years ago, I had a man come through here who was in town for business, I guess. He was from out of state, but he came to our church on a Sunday. And then he wrote me a letter once he got back home. And he wrote me a letter and said, you know, and I was in your church last Sunday. It was, you know, I really enjoyed it. The people were friendly. I liked your sermon. The music was great. Da-da-da-da-da. Did you know you have an idol in front of your church? And he was referring to the sculpture of Jesus. And not only did he tell me in the letter that we had an idol in front of our church, he then had Xeroxed a page of the dictionary with the definition of the word idol, in case I needed to see what the definition of an idol was. And he had, you know, Xeroxed several other articles about idolatry. And it was so weird because he was so complimentary, but then telling us that we were idolatrous by having the sculpture of Jesus. A couple of years later, he passed through again. He worshiped here again. He sent me the same letter. Well, not literally the same, but the same point. Do I think the sculpture of Jesus is idolatry? No, I don't think it is. Because it's not what was happening in Canaan when the Israelites went into Canaan. The people had fertility gods, that they worshipped, that they bowed down to. But the idea is no idolatry. Verse 3, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not hold anyone blameless who misuses his name. I think when I was growing up, I thought this meant don't curse. Don't use God's name as a curse word, which I think is bad. I don't think we should use God's name as a curse word. I think it's rude and offensive, and when people say Jesus Christ as a curse word, they're using the name of my Savior as a curse word. But I think that's not really what this verse is about. This verse is about someone saying, I swear to God, blah, blah, blah. And they're using God's name to swear, and often for something that's not true. They're using the name of God, like, well, I swear to God, this is what's going to happen. And they're misusing God's name. Or, I think, in our context also, I think, well, it's a long story, but I think people who use the name of God or Jesus as if it's sort of a magic word, like, I command you to do this in the name of Jesus. Like, they're using Jesus' name like it's a magic spell, which I think is also misusing God's name. God is not our genie. Jesus is not our genie to use his name as a name of power that we can command somebody something. The fourth one, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. Seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord. On it shall not any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, all that's in them. He rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Most of us are not perfect at following this one. I do think that, people who have to work on Sundays, like maybe ministers, you still have to find a way to have a day of rest or a time of rest and worship. Some people, have to work on Sundays. But I think if we ignore the idea of the Sabbath, of course, Jesus, remember, says, man was not made for the Sabbath. Man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. In other words, it's a gift from God. It's not a noose around our neck. And as I said, having gone to Israel and seeing some of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, for them it is a noose around their neck, and for the Pharisees it was a noose around their neck. The Sabbath made life harder. The prohibition of all the things they couldn't do. The Pharisees in Jesus' time, you couldn't carry anything that weighed more than this many ounces. You couldn't tie a knot on the Sabbath. You couldn't, they had thousands of rules of things you couldn't do on the Sabbath that just made life miserable. Most Orthodox Jews will not ride in a car on the Sabbath because a car involves ignition, and that's starting a fire, and starting a fire is work. Orthodox Jews will cook all their food on Friday before sundown because turning on the stove is work, because that's making a fire. I think I've told the example in Israel. We were there on the Sabbath in a hotel. There was an elevator in the hotel that stopped at every floor on the way up and stopped at every floor on the way down. Why? Because pushing the button would be work. And so, the ultra-Orthodox take the idea of not working on the Sabbath to a extreme that makes it doesn't make it a joy, it makes it a burden. So it's not meant to be a burden, it's meant to be a gift, and say, everybody needs rest, and everybody needs worship, and everybody needs family, and etc. So those first four are kind of one section. Only worship God, don't worship idols, don't misuse God's name, and honor the seventh day. Then the rest of them have more to do. Those 4 have to do kind of with our relationship to God. The other 6 have more to do with our relationship with each other. The first of which is honor your father and mother. And notice it doesn't say obey your father and mother. It says honor them, because the example is always comes up. The parent who says to their child, go buy me drugs. Go buy me beer. Go steal this from the store. There's a time when a child should not obey their parent. And this is not just about kids. This is about adults obeying their adult parents, adults and their adult parents. You honor your family. You honor your parents. That doesn't always mean you obey them. Why? So that you may live long in the land. It's the only one of the 10 Commandments that has a promise attached to it. We honor our parents. Sometimes that doesn't always mean obeying them. With a young child, it usually means that. Again, unless you're the example of the terrible parent who's making their child do something awful. You shall not murder. The translation should be you shall not murder. It doesn't say you shall not kill. The Hebrew word is the word for murder, not the word for kill. So you can kill the spider in your in your house. You can, it's obvious from all the other rules and laws in the Bible that it did not forbid all killing. There's lots of capital punishment here in the Old Testament, so it's about murder, not about any killing of anything. Don't commit adultery, which don't murder and commit adultery and steal and give false testimony and covet. They all go together because they're all part of really the same thing about how we treat our neighbor. We don't take our neighbor's life. We don't take our neighbor's spouse. We don't take our neighbor's stuff. We don't take our neighbor's reputation. And we don't covet what belongs to our neighbor. So it's all about what you take from your neighbor. You don't, and so adultery, even though I think promiscuity is not good for people, it's not about promiscuity. It's about adultery. It's about taking somebody else's spouse. And that's what's forbidden, from taking another person's spouse, taking their stuff. And when it says false testimony, notice it doesn't say don't lie. It says don't give false testimony. Again, lying is not a good thing, except when it's necessary. David lies to the enemy multiple times in the Bible. David lies to the Philistines several times. Jonathan lies to his father to protect David's life. I mean, there's multiple stories in the Bible of people lying for the right reason. In general, lying is wrong. But again, the example that's always brought up in the 20th century is if you're in Poland in 1937 and the Nazis come to your door and say, "Are you hiding any Jews in your attic?" And you are, you lie. You say, no Jews here. I mean, there are times when lying is justified for a greater purpose. But in general, we don't lie. But you certainly don't character assassinate. And that's what it talks about, false testimony against your neighbor. You don't swear false testimony against your neighbor. And then this idea of coveting, again, it doesn't just mean, well, gosh, he's got such a nice car. I'd like a nice car. I mean, it's nothing wrong with admiring somebody else's, car or house or, hat or something and going, oh, that's nice. It's not about that. It's about, the coveting is more like, I want that. I want what he has. He doesn't deserve that. I should have that. It's a little more nefarious than just admiring something that somebody has. So these are the 10 Commandments. And, there's sermon series about those, and there's books about them, and there's all kinds of things. But these are the 10 the Jews call them the 10 words. It says, when the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, and they trembled in fear. And they stayed at a distance, and they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we'll listen, but don't let God speak to us, or we're going to die. And Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. God hath come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning. And the people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. And speaking of worship, then there's this little sort of addendum about how when you worship God. Verse 22, tell the Israelites this, you've seen for yourselves that I've spoken to you from heaven. Don't make any gods or be alongside me. Don't make for yourself gods of silver or gods of gold. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice it on your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and your goats and your cattle. Whenever I cause my name to be honored, I'll come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, don't build it with dressed stones. You'll defile it if you use a tool on it. And don't go up to my altar on steps, lest your nakedness be exposed on it. And this is a really odd little thing. People didn't wear underwear. In other words, don't do something where somebody could look up your robe and see your nakedness. That's why there's no steps. But the idea of it's supposed to be natural stone, not cut stone. And you can say, well, what's the point behind that? Well, there's not a lot of agreement on that. Now, having said that, in the next 20 minutes, when you turn the page, you start to see for chapters 21, 22, and 23, case law. And again, most scholars, even conservative or more progressive, whatever, most scholars would say, here's what we have in the scriptures. We have God giving the 10 commandments. Then over time, people have to take those 10 commandments and apply them to specific situations. And that's what I call case law. And some of what you might say is somewhat picky laws, because if you get into chapter 21 and 22, it has to do, well, if my ox gores your ox, how much do I have to pay you to compensate you for the loss of the ox? Mostly, that's probably not what God is saying on Mount Sinai. God is probably not giving them specific laws about what to do if my ox gores your ox and how much I have to pay you. That is probably over time, as the Hebrew people reflected on the 10 Commandments, they had to sometimes say, well, it says don't steal, but what if I destroy your property? Is that stealing? Well, kinda. Then how do we, if I've destroyed your property, I've taken something from you, what's the penalty for that? Or how do you compensate for that? And most would say that probably what we see in chapters 21 and 22 and 23 have more to do with the Hebrew people developing case law out of the 10 Commandments than something that was dictated on Mount Sinai at the same time as the 10 Commandments. I mean, if you think about it, you think about the 10 Commandments are like the Constitution of the United States. You say, well, that's all we need. We don't need any other laws. We just need to have the Constitution, right? Well, except the Constitution doesn't speak to every scenario. The Constitution doesn't speak to every possibility. And so, laws flow out of the Constitution, and then we have to make sure they agree with the Constitution. Well, let's just look at some of the laws that are part of chapters 21 and 22 and 23. The first section is about slavery. For example, 21:2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he should go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he's to go free alone. If he has a wife when he comes, she's to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. Okay, and right off the bat, we're like, I don't know about that. One, we're not real comfortable with the Bible endorsing slavery, although, believe me, in the 19th century, in the South, you better believe preachers were saying, slavery's right here in the Bible. You know, God ordained slavery. You got preachers saying that in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. Notice this is about a Hebrew servant, probably one who has sold himself into slavery because of debt. And a Hebrew has now sold himself into slavery, and he's working, or his master has purchased him for his debt, and it's saying, after you work for 6 years, that's enough. You get to go free. Which I don't think was a rule that was followed in the South in the 1800s. I don't think they set slaves free after 6 years. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's, is indentured servitude the same as slavery? I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but it's not good. And as you see, the idea of like, okay, well, but the wife and kids don't get to go with him when he goes free. And then you keep going. 5, but if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I don't want to go free, his master must take him before the judges and take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he'll be his servant for life. So, like, hey, I don't want to go out there and in the hard world. I'll just stay with you and be your servant for life. Well, okay, we're going to put probably for an earring of some kind as a sign of slavery. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as men servants do. So there's not much equality there. Only men get to go free after 7 years, not the women. If she doesn't please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners. He has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he doesn't provide her with those 3 things, she's to go free without any payment of money. Yeah, and you say, I'm always a little bit, there are people who say, I follow every single thing in the Bible. You go, well, what about Exodus 21? Do we still follow that? Should we still follow that? About how we enforce slavery? Then we go to injuries, personal injury in verse 12. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. Okay, so that's murder, the death penalty for murder. However, if he doesn't do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he's free. He is to flee to a place I will designate. In other words, manslaughter is different from murder. But, and again, we haven't gotten there yet, but flee to a place I will designate. You know what that's talking about? There were what were called cities of refuge. And there were also places, altars in tabernacles and temples. Because here's what reality was in that world at that time. Excuse me, let me just... So let's say I accidentally kill somebody, and it's manslaughter. It's not murder, it's manslaughter. Through my negligence or through an accident, I kill somebody. This says you're not going to face the death penalty here. It says he is to flee to a place I will designate. Because if I accidentally kill somebody by accident, guess what's going to happen in the ancient world? His family is going to come after me to kill me. And I have to go to a place of refuge. They were designated cities of refuge where you could flee from the revenge of a family who was out to kill you in revenge for you killing a family member. And, there were places, this is something that's not just in ancient Israel. This is something that there were places where you could flee from the law. Like, anybody know a word that is about fleeing from the law? Sanctuary, sanctuary. Hunchback of Notre Dame, etc. The law couldn't get them if they were in the church. It was sanctuary from the law in the church. So it says, but if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. So if somebody has said, oh, it was an accident, and they flee to the altar of the tabernacle, but it really wasn't an accident, it was really was murder, it says even if he's claiming sanctuary, pull him off the altar and take him out and execute him. Sanctuary doesn't work if they determine that it wasn't an accident, that it was deliberate. Anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. The word attack there probably means murder. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or has him when he's caught must be put to death. Anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. That would be a pretty rough law in the books today, wouldn't it? Anyone who curses their parents, it's a death penalty? Okay, now we're getting really into specific situations. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he doesn't die, but he's confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. So this is getting into personal injury and compensating people for their lost wages and lost time, unless, of course, you're a slave. Verse 20, if a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he's not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. So, and notice it says if he beats the slave and the slave dies, he must be punished. It doesn't say killed, because killing a slave doesn't carry the same weight as killing somebody who's not a slave, obviously, here. Even very, very specific rules. Verse 22, if men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, which probably means a miscarriage, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. If there's serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So this is where the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that is heard in the modern world as barbaric. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But here, it's not heard that way. It's heard, if I poke out your eye, you can only poke out my eye. You can't kill me. If I knock out your tooth, you can knock out my tooth, but you can't kill me. In other words, it's the idea of avoiding escalation, because that's how wars start. I take out your eye, you take out both of mine. My family murders you. Your family murders my entire family. My tribe murders your entire tribe and anyone related to it. And, in other words, escalate until, we got Israel and Iran going at each other with nuclear weapons. It's the idea of the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., is about not escalating the violence. It's about keeping. Now, this is there in the scriptures, and what does Jesus say about it? Jesus says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say," what does he say? Yeah, he says, "Pray for those that persecute you. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Love your enemy," etc., etc. So Jesus takes this and says, Jesus. And notice he doesn't say, "The Lord said," or "God said." He says, "It has been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." So Jesus contradicts this. If a man hits his manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. If he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or a maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. I'm not going to read all these are like, okay, the next one is about if a bull gores somebody, how do you got to execute the bull, which seems pretty unfair too. But notice it says, if a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. It is now defiled. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible, unless, if however, the bull had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned about it, but hasn't kept it pinned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. So, if the bull just breaks loose, it's the first time it's ever happened, and kills somebody, the owner is not held responsible. But if this is a bad animal that's breaking out of its pen, or he hasn't kept it pinned up, and it does this all the time, and it gores somebody to death, that's the death penalty for that guy. And that would go back to all kinds of current laws about, again, how are you held responsible for something? If you were in the habit of not locking up your guns or whatever. I mean, if you had something that was obviously dangerous and you did nothing about it, and then somebody dies, you're probably not going to get the death penalty, but you are going to get sued in our current culture. And it's talking about if you dig a pit and you don't give any warning and somebody falls in it, that's a problem. And again, more about these kind of personal injury laws. I'm not going to read all the property law stuff that's in chapter 22, because it's about what happens if my animal kills your animal, and what you're to do if you make restitution, if my livestock grazes in your field, what's the restitution necessary if your animal gets into my land, or my animal gets into your land, what you doing with stolen goods. Look at verse 22:7. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping, and they're stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he's caught, must pay back double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, any other lost property, about when someone says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judge. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. Sounds like the people's court needs to be involved in that, doesn't it? And look at 22:14. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor and it's injured or dies while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. If the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. So I said, this is case law. And when we say, there are 616 laws in the Old Testament. Okay? There are 616 laws in the Old Testament. The Pharisees were excited about the fact that they obeyed all 616. You know, we Christians, the question has always been, well, how much of this is binding on us as Christians? I mean, how much of the Old Testament laws are binding on us? Well, the more, I guess, standard answer has usually been, when you look at the Old Testament laws, they really fall into three categories. There are moral laws. That would be the Ten Commandments, are moral laws. There are civic laws that have to do with, if my ox gores your ox, how much do I owe you, etc. Those are civic laws. And then there are ceremonial laws that have to do, we're getting into those, like, you know, what you have to wear at a certain time and what festival you have to observe and those kind of things. So the laws really fall into three categories: moral, civic, ceremonial laws. And the answer that has usually been given pretty much for most of Christianity is, as Christians, we are still under the moral laws, but we are no longer under the civic or the ceremonial laws, you know, which we know from the book of Acts, we're not under the food laws. You know, that they have the whole account of Peter and the sheet coming down from heaven and God telling Peter, eat it, go ahead and eat it. And Peter's like, oh, no, I can't eat that. And he says, if God has made it, it's clean, it's kosher. And, you know, we know that specific story in the book of Acts frees us from kosher laws. But in general, you know, when people have said, well, what about, you know, now as followers of Christ, you know, how much of the Old Testament are we really sort of under? They'd say, well, the moral laws, we are under. But the ceremonial laws and the civic laws about the property line and my animal and your animal and those kind of things, those really are for that specific time and place. Those aren't really binding on us. And that's been pretty much and it's even been, I think the most hardcore literalist Christian person, if you said to them, all right, so death penalty for cursing your parents, would probably not go that far. Would probably not say that should be a law here in the U.S. of A, that if you curse your parents, you get the death penalty. I don't think. I had when Desi was our associate, there was a fellow who came in here and he wanted to see the windows because his grandfather had been a member here, 70 years ago. And anyway, he just wanted to see, not these windows, but the older windows from the old sanctuary. And he just wanted to see the building, and that was fine. And he happened to be a Baptist, and he noticed that we had a female associate, and he proceeded to tell me that, that was not biblical to have a female associate, that, it says in the Bible, in the New Testament, women are not to speak and all that and this and this. And I said, oh, okay. I said, so, that you think that's really binding? And he says, yeah. He says, everything in the Bible is still binding. Every law there is binding. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I said, how does your wife like covering her head at all times? And he's like, what? I said, well, Paul says women are to cover their heads at all times. Does your wife cover her head at all times? Do people at your church the women at your church cover their heads at all times? Like, well, no. I said, well, that's in the Bible. And of course, he was then at a loss for words. He didn't have any response for that, because people who say they follow everything usually follow certain things and they dismiss other parts, and that's all of us. I mean, all of us fall short. It's just that, when we read some of these things that I think are case law for the people of Israel in another time and place, most of us don't have oxen. Most of us don't worry about our ox goring somebody else's ox. It's probably not anything we need to worry about, but it does give insight into that culture of that time. It does tell us how they took the Ten Commandments, I believe. They took the Ten Commandments and said, okay, how does that commandment apply to this situation? How can we enforce the Ten Commandments on this situation? And this is the stuff they came up with. And for that culture in that time, I think that was probably how they had to operate, but it's probably Jesus himself begins to say, you've heard it said this, but I say something totally different. And I think that tells us something about the way that Jesus basically takes some of these things and says, no, we're not doing that anymore. Kind of gives us some insight as well. But I think it's a fascinating look at the early Hebrew people and how they took what God gave them and then began to apply it. And when they're wandering around in the desert, some of these laws were probably not in effect until they actually got to Canaan and actually did settle the land. But now they're here because they didn't care about the chronology like we tend to care about. So anyway, hopefully that doesn't sound too confusing because I was jumping all over the place myself. But anyway, let's pray. Lord, we are grateful for all you do and grateful for, Lord, this man Moses that you chose for such a difficult responsibility. And yet, Lord, we see in your miracles, we see the way in which you were faithful, the way you brought these people out of slavery and eventually into that land you promised their forefathers. And Lord, they weren't perfect, just like we aren't either. But we thank you. We hear that word, that call to be a kingdom of priests. And we know as we've been, as Paul says, as we've been grafted onto the tree of Israel, as we've been grafted on like a wild branch onto this family tree, that we too are to spread the news, the good news of Jesus, the good news that you are a loving and compassionate God, that we are to also be that kingdom of priests, sharing love and hope and the grace of Christ. We pray in his name. Amen.